Mrs. Yarrow,
Satanas! Hail, Satan! Hail, Satan! Hail, Satan!
Greetings, heathens. Welcome to Hail Satan. This is the podcast exploring Satanism, culture, and life in general through the eyes of modern Satanists. My name is Joseph Rose, and I am a member of an amazing independent congregation called Satanic Delco. And we do welcome members from anywhere in the world. If you want to learn a little bit more about us, visit satanicdelco.com. Today, I'm going to present you with the second of our roundtable discussions, this time focused on the second of the 7 fundamental tenets of the Satanic Temple. Before we get to that, let me acknowledge some wonderful people that have joined up on Patreon recently. We have Richard, Joselina, Julia, Gershom, Ashes, Patrick, Tatiana, Shania, Zane, John, Logan, Tyler, Travis, Brian, Victor, VH, Christopher, Taryn, Jonathan, Becca, and Trevor. Thank you all very, very much. You know that I love and appreciate your support, and really you make all of this possible. So thank you very much. If you have a moment, everybody, please visit the website at hailsatanpodcast.com. You'll find links to join me on social media, a form to send me an email, and a link to join up with us all on Patreon. We have a few different tiers to choose from on there with various benefits, and that is the most direct way you can support me and this show if you'd like to do that. Visit hailsatanpodcast.com. Okay, now I will let you listen in on a portion of our roundtable discussion on the second tenet. That tenet is: the struggle for justice is an ongoing and necessary pursuit that should prevail over laws and institutions. About 40 of us from Satanic Delco were on the Zoom chat for this one, and the discussion went on for well over 2 hours. Obviously, I edited down a portion of that to share with you all on here, so let's get right into it. Here we go. Cora, you've got a hand raised. Go ahead.
I just think this is the most satanic of all the tenets, to be honest, because if you look at the real reality of who Satan is, it's Satan the accuser, Satan the, arbiter of justice. To me, that is who I see as Satan, as the person and the symbol that I look to, right? So that tenet really is what I take to heart when I think about my activism, when I think about the different things that I do in my life to push the boundaries, even when it comes to social justice, helping refugees, it doesn't really matter. You have to do what is right. And I think that is where that comes in, even if it's standing up to a God like Satan did. I guess that's my thing.
Don't let me put you on the spot here, but I just want to ask a little about why you feel it is particularly a satanic quality. We know there's lots of versions or examples of the character of Satan out there, and it's different things to different people from different sources. Is there anything that stands out as to why you feel like this one is satanic?
For me, that it's because they, Satanists are the outsiders. Satanists are the people who are, the other, who are always looked down upon. And most of us have different things that we're going through. To me, it really allows us, it's who we are as people. If we look at our group, and we look at why we chose Satan, that is why we did it. It's because he is the outsider. He is the one who's challenging the status quo, the norm of what everyone is doing. And to me, that is why, at the core of me, that I'm a Satanist. That is why I look to this tenet as one of the most important things that you can do is challenge arbitrary authority and seek justice. To me, it's just a core part of my identity. Yep.
Cool. Thank you, Cora. Next up, Tomoe. What have you got?
In addition to everything that Cora just said, I flip it on the upside down level because I'm coming from the perspective of a non-binary, mixed race, pansexual, female presenting person. So in the history of things, it's white men get favored. So the law just kind of continuously takes a shit on people like me and people of color in general. So this attitude is exactly what I want to see in other people. And being a Satanist is, like Cora said, just being that rebel and embodying that kind of stuff moving forward. So this tenet, I think, is a very fucking important and a satanic one on that level.
Definitely. As you were saying that, and you pointed out white men, and, it's easy. I mean, we can take a look at the world and it's easy to see that white men as a category have enjoyed a lot of
power.
Yeah, they've enjoyed a lot of privilege and positions of power throughout the decades and longer. Do you think white men through time have intentionally done things in a way that would protect or enable the white men club to continue its thing? Or do you think there's an underlying subconscious nature where a group of people just have their own perspective and sort of just go about their business, not necessarily meaning to preserve only themselves or to be somehow negative toward others, but because
a little bit of both.
Yeah, that's
a little bit of both for sure, because of the way that society is structured right now.
Yeah.
And certainly a lot of progress has been made. We're seeing a lot of gay rights laws coming into place. We're seeing a lot of trans people coming into light, and not all of the news is great on that front. Texas.
Oh, yeah.
But, it's making headlines, whereas maybe 30 years ago, wouldn't have made headlines, wouldn't have even been a fucking thing. Yeah, so stuff is shifting. It's just very, very slowly, but the pursuit of justice should prevail above all laws and institutions.
Yeah. All right, thanks, T. We've got a hand up from Red Moon.
So I actually wrote something about what this tenet does mean to me and how I process this tenet. For me, I wrote this tenet was kind of tricky for me because it is a pretty risky tenet to think about. It is one of those that you really have to critically think about for a long while until it makes sense to the individual. And here's an example of how I think and I use this tenet. A good chunk of people these days has a pretty decent resume on peacefully protesting, coming together to speak on an issue. However, unfortunately, we don't live in a world that takes kindly to any resistance, even our governments, etc., police, whatever. Even if it is peaceful, we know, especially nowadays with what we see on social media, how an institution can start oppressing voices. For example, nowadays, the Russian people who are protesting against the war, Black Lives Matter, LGBTQ rights, protests, and other assemblies all had institutions arrest protesters. But as a protester, you have to understand that risk. But for the struggle for justice, these sacrifices are not only needed, but required for any progress to even happen.
Yeah, the people protesting any given thing ever are looking for change, obviously, and in their eyes, they would call that progress. And in the eyes of whoever it is they're protesting against, it would be the opposite, maybe, of progress, an unwelcome change of some kind. It all depends on the specifics of the situation to make a subjective call about which one is progress, which one is good, which one is bad. And inevitably, we're going to have people with opinions on both sides of every issue, I'm sure.
Of course.
And that is the tricky part.
Yeah, there is a humanistic quality of it too. What will eventually make a certain marginalized group get better care in the world.
With this one, the most simple sort of example that I think of all the time is civil rights generally, because the laws and institutions said one thing. For example, these people aren't equal. These people can't vote. At time, that's been black people. It's been women, you name it. And that was actually the law of the land. And the spirit of the law didn't feel in line with the actual laws and institutions in those cases. And so it was up to the people to strive for their version of justice. They thought this is wrong, and the laws and institutions aren't in the right. And so we need to do whatever we can to make that change. And of course, a lot of those changes were made, and different changes continue to be made over time in essentially the same type of way, modern versions of the same things, sometimes literally the same things, marches, loud voices, things like that. So yeah, civil rights activism versus the law of the land, I think, is the most simplified example of this one in action. And thanks for that. Next up, Dan.
So I do believe in the second tenet, but I will say it is the only tenet that makes me feel a little uneasy at times.
Sure, explain.
When I consider some of the things it could lend itself to, things like vigilantism,
Yes.
because it's reasonable to interpret the second tenet as an endorsement of taking justice into your own hands.
Correct.
Which, it's not necessarily a wrong approach, but the thing is that the idea of what justice is can vary so much from person to person. It's just very subjective.
Yeah.
So when we think of the folks that stormed the Capitol, for example, I'm sure none of them identified as Satanists, but they were operating on the principles endorsed by the second tenet. But then, on the other hand, when I consider things like the civil rights movement and the sort of oppressive laws and institutions throughout history, and even in the present day, I ultimately agree with the second tenet. And I will say I do think it helps a lot that this tenet is applied within the context of Satanism, where ideas of what's good or bad aren't founded in things like divine edicts. So if a Satanist is applying the principles of this tenet, there's at least the hope that their idea of justice is grounded in some sort of sensible philosophy, or at least something, because the invisible man in the sky says so.
Yeah, Right as you started, the first thing I thought of was, I bet you the people at the Capitol felt like, or would tell you, that they were striving for some sort of justice. And justice is
They will. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they will. And not only will they say it, they believe it. Probably pretty seriously. They probably deeply believe it, because you've got to be genuine enough about something to take an action the way that they did. That's probably not a super casual decision to make about, a random day. Here's what I'm going to do. They probably felt that it was worthwhile and important. And justice, like most things that we could think of, are subjective. And there's probably a lot of people here tonight that would counter one of those people saying that they were looking for justice with, well, you were misguided at the very least. But yeah, you're right. One person's justice is maybe someone else's oppression. And that's the way it goes sometimes. Ashley, you're up.
Okay, so I wanted to start first by saying that injustice is one of the things that really lights a fire in me. It's one of the things that has always made me feel like a deep, that burn inside that we feel when we're heated, angry, passionate. But I also think that in addition to standing up for the bigger injustices in the world, I think this can also be taken further in challenging fairness in our daily lives, like at work or school. If we see these things, I think that's our duty as humans to challenge those things, to challenge people to critically think and have empathy and compassion, and helping other people out if we can. We have to do it.
Yeah.
I think it's just something that is ingrained in human nature, as well as evil things that are ingrained in human nature.
Yeah. Would you say, maybe this is strong, but would you say that anyone should feel an obligation to somehow actively participate in the struggle for justice?
I would say yes and no, because people are different.
And even that is vague. The struggle
the,
for justice even is vague. There's so many ways that one could.
Right. I mean, I think if you're passionate about something, and it is an injustice issue that is grounded within reason, I think you owe it to yourself to go after it and pursue it. And I think that's where this can play into that. So. Yeah.
Even thinking about all the ways, the actual tangible ways, sometimes it becomes obvious and you can't miss it when there are things like civil rights or the protests following various police issues, George Floyd, and so many of these things that happen, wars, conflicts, you name it. There's so many things that can rile up a group of people and motivate them to one way or another react or fight for what they feel is the right thing, for justice. And there's inevitably the conflict that exists that it represents the laws and institutions. And that's another thing to consider.
I know that's a slippery slope for sure, because we could say that, but then, these parents that are going in and saying that, literally bombarding school board meetings and stuff like that, like they think they are fighting injustice.
That's
and,
right.
The majority of us are like, what can you stop? So it's like, I say that, but at the same time, I feel like there's that within reason with compassion and empathy. Like if we're, like we were talking about with Tenet 1, these will kind of all stack on each other. So if we're at 2, we also have to think about 1.
That's right. Yeah. And you can, and they're all intertwined. So many of them get intertwined,
right.
and within all of this involves, you could easily involve tenet number 4 and the freedom to offend and things like that. It's a wild web of human interactions and emotions and all of that. Yeah, it's important. Thank you, Ashley. Bobby, you're next.
Yeah. Justice is subjective. Doesn't mean the same thing to everybody. All of our morals and values are different. So we don't all want the same things. We don't all see the same things as oppressive. And our judicial system is terrible. Laws and institutions are mainly here to oppress everyone.
Yeah, by nature of you being able to have that opinion, there are immediately people that would say, well, no, our system works really great, and it's we have justice because of this system. And I can't say which one is right or wrong. I mean, there's countless examples in favor of probably both directions. There are times, there are times when groups of people were only able to find justice because of the system that's in place. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been able to. And there are surely people who've been tread upon by the system and can't find justice perhaps within the system, or even maybe because of the system. It's hard to say. Thank you, Bobby. Cora, you're up.
I think one of the things I'd like to highlight is that you can't think about every tenant in isolation from the world. Like, I look at what we're doing right now, and that's great that we're going to focus on one, but what constitutes justice, what constitutes everything, that's where there's other tenets. That's where there's other satanic philosophies to look at. For me, a good example specific to like my group, which is transgender, right, is one's body is inviolable subject to one's own will, which is the next tenet, right? Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I look at something like transgender youth getting their health care for gender affirming care taken away just, like by people who have no idea what the actual like science says or anything like that, or how trans people actually feel about it, right? They don't talk to us. They're just making this up. And I've even started to suggest things like maybe we need to find someone who is transgender and 17, right? Who can't get their stuff, their things in Texas, right? The medication, they have to drive to another state to go get medication. Yeah. Right. Which I actually know someone who's doing that because of the laws that have been put in place. And to me, it's like, well, we're Satanists and we have a religion and it says my body's inviolable. So give me my meds. Yeah. At a certain point, could you even claim, is that even an example of how I could say that violates my religious freedom to not be able to get my medication because my body's inviolable? Or abortion law, right? And I think for me, that's where this kind of comes in. Like, we need to look at it not in isolation, but in the greater scheme of the morality that Satanists follow.
Yeah. And when you see these people on the other side who are pushing for these different laws and rules and things that will work against a group like trans people or transgender youth specifically, what do you tend to think their motivation is?
I believe it's religiously motivated, personally. Yeah. I honestly think that it's based upon a misunderstanding of their own even religion, because it tends to be Christians who have that point of view. And you can't, take that out of the context because they're the ones who are pushing for it.
Yeah.
They see it as a form of justice because we are violating their God's law. We're not violating the law of even a state or something like that in general, in most places. We're violating their morals, right? Their religion, but
because theirs is the only way.
Because theirs is the only way. And I think that that's where that struggle, that, thing needs to prevail over those laws and institutions, such as religious entities. Yeah. And we can't take that out of the context of everything, because looking at, something like the Christian church and how they have done this and are getting involved in politics now, forcing people like me to be afraid, quite literally. To me, that's where this tenet comes in.
Yeah. Thank you, Cora. Essie, you're up.
Well, I think probably the first thing this was probably the first tenet that actually drew me into looking into Satanism and all of that, because to me, it's very active and it's very unlike any other. I grew up, in a very Catholic family, and it's very unlike anything growing up in that regard. Though I did, growing up also, I was always very involved in protesting things, as many Catholics do, going to marches, pro-life marches and whatnot. But I think what it is that it's to me, it suggests that it's something that we're needing to be doing, and it's very active, and I like that. Yeah. About it. And I think I know it challenges me to not be complacent, which I think can be really easy to do. And there's so much going on, and it's overwhelming. There's wars happening in Europe, and we are constantly bombarded with anti-trans bills, all this legislation against women's bodies and our reproductive justice. So to me, it's a call to action. And I think much like what was said before, it's like you can't just isolate it too, because it does go on with these others. So I guess I'm kind of speaking in draft here, but that was just something that for me, it's very active and challenges us too.
And you said that was the one that sort of got your attention and hooked you at first?
For sure. Yeah.
Yeah. And now there's always, I see discussions a lot. I don't know if it's quite a debate, but when people talk about the Satanic Temple generally, there's a lot of discussion. Some people will say, oh, well, they're an activist group or a political activist group. And sometimes that can be said as just sort of, factually, well, that's what that group appears to be. And I think some use it almost in a derogatory way, maybe not derogatory, but they're belittling the value of Satanism, or at least the organization of the Satanic Temple as a religious organization, by means of saying, well, they're not a religion, they're an activist group only. And would you say that was, when you saw it, was it sort of connecting with you just on that level of, okay, this is activism and I want in?
Maybe at least for me, activism has, like I said, growing up, going to these, anti-choice marches and things, activism has always been part of my religion.
Yeah.
But I guess in the same realm, they would never say something, they would never say something like this, I don't think. And just like we were saying, you can use anything to meet your perspective, or, you know, we can say justice is subjective or whatever. Yeah. But I think for me, just because it was like, it's in the tenets, so is that I was like, okay, this is what to me is really important. And especially as like an educator and as a performer, and we were talking about, you know, people's rights being taken away and people being discriminated because they're different. To me, it's like, that was, I don't know, to me, that was the major thing that drew me in.
Yeah. I can imagine that this tenet and the spirit of it generally and the way it's worded is the one that would really connect with the fist in the air person who is looking for that, you know, who already feels that way, but to find that idea sort of articulated by a group like the Satanic Temple can be powerful. I'm sure you're not the only one that it grabbed in that way.
Probably not. No.
Yeah.
But.
Cool. Thank you, Essie. Mm-hmm. Russ.
This is kind of tough for me, but the second one of Ongoing Pursuit, it's more like a lifetime. And number 6 kind of messes with me as well. When I was 8, I've had 40 years to think about it, and it still doesn't get any better. I was molested as a kid, and my cousin both, by his uncle. I think about it a lot every day, you know, and it's like his backstory. He was schizophrenic because as a child, he was growing up, he watched his mom get raped when they were hitchhiking on the side of the road. So I think at 6, you know, people are fallible, but is there an extent to anything for justice or fallibility as being a human? Where do you start and where do you stop with that?
Yes. I debated whether or not to directly include this idea in this chat or if it's worthy of a separate one. It is the idea of justice versus forgiveness and which one takes priority and when and why and all of those things. And that's the kind of what came to mind when you were just saying that.
Yeah, because I'll never forgive, because to this day, you know, I base how my life is going off of everything that happened with that. Yeah. You know, my relationship status sucks because anytime I get close to somebody, I push them away. Because I guess when I talk to counselors and everything, I wasn't on Monday Night Zoom because, unfortunately, if you want to call it that, this is that anniversary. But I can't forgive them because of the fact that, you know, I consider all my relationship status as a failure, because once I get too close to somebody, I love them to death, but I always find a way out because I just have a hard time connecting. I don't want to love somebody and then something bad happen, I guess. So it's just the point of, you know, I always want to see justice done, but his mom passed several years ago, so he's in an institution. Oh. You know, there's parts of me that don't want to blame him because he had his own issues. But then again, I blame him every day for the fact of how he fucked up my life.
Yeah, I mean, I can't relate directly, but I can only imagine that type of struggle that you have to deal with. I'm sorry you have to deal with that.
Yeah.
Man, and even connecting justice to that, we've talked about it a lot in the context of more social justice, things like civil rights and all of that type of stuff. But there is obviously the more singular version of that, justice to an individual, like in this case. And maybe we'll touch on things like, I don't know, one that pops up in my mind is something like the West Memphis 3 cases where individuals have been affected and may or may not have found justice through their struggles for it. I don't know if that directly connects in any meaningful way, but I appreciate you being willing to share all that with us, Russ. And of course, you can talk amongst the group about anything you like at your leisure. There's always people willing to listen.
Yeah, I just had to because you look at like the dark side of me. It's like, you know, I got 2 bullets right over here thinking it's either going to be me or him, but he's out of my picture. I have too much to live for.
Yeah.
But then I try to forgive because it's not necessarily always his fault, because he did have issues in his head too.
Yes.
So I try to look at both images, but that's where it's so hard to differentiate between, okay, this happened, I got to get over it, but you just can't get over it. It's always there. You learn to live with it.
Yeah, of
but
course.
It's not something you want to live with.
I don't think anyone could ever blame you if you felt like you could never forgive a person like that. But a thing that came up when we had discussed this before was the idea that forgiving someone is really more about the forgiver, I think. If you're able to not just say the words, hey, I forgive you, it's okay, that's one thing, and that's nice. And on that level, it's more for the other person, the person being forgiven. But to actually mean it, to really mean it, to inside feel like that you've forgiven someone who has wronged you in some way, most of that work benefits you, the person who's doing the forgiving. Because if you're carrying around that weight of whatever it is, a resentment, an anger, a whatever, holding a grudge in some cases, if you could call it that, finally letting it go in the form of like an actual genuine forgiveness is probably goes a long way in helping you. And I don't mean specifically you, but maybe you as well. It goes a long way in helping you heal and move forward and letting that go. Because I can only imagine, it's not the same, but I've carried around resentment and anger about issues and held grudges over periods of time with people. And I've felt the difference between that and what it feels like when you're actually able to let it go and forgive. So I don't know if your path forward involves that type of forgiveness or not. Like I said, no one could fault you if you didn't feel that way. It would be perfectly reasonable, I think, to not. But maybe something to consider, just for your own sake,
Yeah, I try to, and it's just so hard. There's days it's like, you know what? It's not his fault. Yeah. He had his own issues, but then again, in life, something comes up and it's just like, oh, that son of a bitch, whatever else. But, I deal with it on a day-to-day basis, but you have them times where it comes up and it just kind of hits you hard. But, growing up, as the Christian way, as my mom did and stuff, they always had that do unto others as you'd have do unto you. It's like,
yes.
So how does that work? If they treat me like shit, do I treat them like shit, or do I treat them good no matter what they treat me like? And it's just like, that's just not right, because if they're going to treat me like shit and put me down and degrade me, or why am I going to treat them nice?
Yeah, is that the turn the other cheek, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. They both mean a lot to me, 2 and 6, but it's just a hard spot to be in between them.
It sure is. None of it is easy. Thank you very much, Russ. Rob, you're up.
I'd like to thank Russ for sharing that as well. I think what Russ touched on about like justice is so often the focus of justice is like punitive. It's always like after the fact, are we going to give justice for those who have, wronged us? And I mean, as Russ touched on, a trauma that he's still dealing with today. I mean, I think about myself. When I was 6 years old, a guy came into our backyard, a stranger, and he raped my sister, and I had to like fight off it. And this is this big thing, and I don't want to really go into detail about that, but sure. It stays with you. They're the things that stay with people. And when you think about justice, sending people to prison and all those things, and you think even when the attacker or your violator goes to prison, the trauma doesn't disappear. You still have to have the moral hazard, the weights are put on you to have to go to put your time into therapy, and all that struggle continues. And so as a society, when we think about taking justice into our own hands and all these things, society gives us these scaffoldings, these things you say that they tell you you're supposed to be appeased by this. We gave you this. Your tax dollars went to put this guy in a cage for 5 years. Shouldn't you be satiated? And yet still, for decades, you're still haunted by these things. And that's why justice is really a struggle, because it's really about creating that what is right, what is fair in your own world, in your own mind, in your own life, in your own community, and as well as in your own nation. So that's a constant struggle that goes from the personal to the larger. And part of that self-assessment, I'd like to really think about a quote that grounds me when I think about my own place in life and whatnot it's a quote from Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine, when he wrote in The Age of Reason back in like 1794, he wrote, "Whatever is my right as a man is also the right of another, and it's my duty to guarantee as well as to possess." So as far as thinking about justice, it means, hey, what do I have that other people should have? And as far as like striving and struggling towards that as well.
Yeah. Maybe I just connect everything in the world to the fourth tenet, but that's really at the root of that one as well. The freedom to offend necessitates you be willing to be offended. And that's always the struggle with that one. I want to be free to say my shit, but I don't like that shit you're saying, so you better stop. Well, it doesn't work that way, right? And you had mentioned, the idea of justice in many cases being punitive, right? And it, in so many cases, especially the way the judicial system works over time, in many cases, it almost requires there to be a victim, be it a person, a group, and something. And so the justice that we work toward doesn't always affect very directly. It's sort of planting justice for the future. It's kind of too late for this person, but we need to make this law work for the next time this comes around, or put things in place so that when this happens inevitably again, we can be ready for it or have rules in place for it. And that kind of thing happens all the time. When somebody shoots up another school, again, people will start the conversation about, we need to change some rules, and, around and around we go. But so much of it is, I think, trying to provide justice for the future based on an incident or something that took place. Thank you, Rob. Frankie, what have you got?
Hi, give me 1 second.
Oh, okay. We'll wait for you, Frank.
Hi. So with the second tenet, I just wanted to basically say that, so when I read it, like the struggle for justice prevailing over laws and institutions, I think the biggest thing with the struggle for justice is that it takes so long to actually evolve our written law. And that's why I think it's super important that people on their day-to-day basis should do things that, if they see like injustice, like somebody being bullied or like a hate crime committed in front of them, something to that nature, it's so important for us to individually like stand up for those things. That way it makes more of like a whole change happen, like kind of behind the scenes, I guess. Because in accordance with the law, anything written, it takes so long because, we have the same people just being elected in different positions, but all like the same group of people generally in our government who are controlling these laws. And it's a lot harder to convince all of those people who have been doing it for like 30, 40, 50 years to change it. But if we can, as people in our communities and like individually change like our mindsets and just our little actions, to be like more compassionate and caring of other situations, I think it overall helps make that slow change happen a little more rapidly, at least for the day-to-day stuff.
Yeah, it requires that application of pressure. And I don't know, what is the saying about the squeaky wheel gets the grease, right? And the squeakier the wheel, the more annoying that shit is, the quicker you're more likely to apply the grease. And that's kind of how it works, right? If there's a few people mad at a law somewhere and they're like, man, this law sucks, but I got stuff to do. Well, that law isn't likely to be changed, or that policy or that mindset at a company or whatever isn't likely. But, when you've got something so undeniable like you had with civil rights leaders and things like that in the 60s, it was sort of like, it's hard to fucking ignore this right now. It's out there every day. It's in our faces. It's growing. This is something that needs to be addressed pretty fucking quickly. And yeah, the wheels turn way too slowly. Like you said, Frank, everything takes too long. The justice system takes too long. The legal system takes too long. Everything moves really slow. And I think it is generally just the will of the people who can help to speed those things up, I guess. It still doesn't feel like it ever moves quickly enough, but I guess if you leave the status quo alone, it will just sit there proud of itself.
I just think it's super important just to at least be aware of it. And as long as people are like talking about these issues and coming together, even in like smaller communities, like sure, laws may get passed that we don't like, but talking about it and still striving to change them should always be like the main goal. Absolutely. And like the main goal should always be that like you individually treat people with respect and that like you can help it around you. Because at the end of the day, like, yeah, our laws are very flawed. Our system fucking sucks. And unfortunately, that's not probably going to change even in my lifetime. Not that I can see. Yeah. But I think just to keep a positive mindset about like just our day to day and like just how we treat each other, at least makes a difference. And especially talking about it and like, you know, even like on TikTok and stuff, I see so many things that like just generally bring me more enlightened to people's experiences, especially like, you know, a couple of my friends recently came out that they're trans. Like growing up, like I went to Catholic high school. So like I didn't even know what that meant until, well, you know, like I'm 25 now. So like my early 20s, I like, that's the first time I really heard what like trans was. Like I never even knew these things really existed in the world. So I like, for me, it might be something new, but like these are things that people have been going through their whole lives. And like, I'm just finding these things out and I'm like, oh my God, like we need to like do all the things we can to like help and change and do all this stuff. And like, I'm realizing like when it's in accordance to the law, it makes it way much harder, way slower. But at least like as a person, I can educate myself and do what I can to kind of just be knowledgeable and aware about the issues around me and kind of help prevent like it that way.
For sure. Good point. And even shrinking that down to a group like ours, like how easy is it to come into a group like ours? Like, what do we have, 40 people or whatever on a thing like this right now. And we've got people from so many different places in the world, so many different lifestyles and lived experiences and you name it. And what a great opportunity for us to be kind of up close and personal with all these different lived experiences that we can learn about and learn from, that like it would have taken years hoping, waiting, wondering if you'd ever run into such a collection of people. We have people that are trans all in our Zoom right now. And we have people that live in places that I'll never be on the Zoom right now. And all of these different things, and it's just a great way for us to be able to get in there and understand a bunch of new things. And, when on a good day, when everybody's in the good mood and we're working the way we should work, we can ask each other all kind of wild questions that if you're just chatting with your friend, it doesn't even feel like a wild question anymore. It feels like, hey, I've been wondering, let's, can we talk about this? And most of the time it's like, yeah, let's talk about it. Unfortunately, the world at large doesn't always have that same opportunity. You're just over there living your life. You live in Oklahoma and you go to work and you just, I don't know, you watch whatever fucking news channel you got and that's what you know. And your perspective is skewed and whatever. There are biases at play. Sometimes it's an unintentional thing, which is a bias. And sometimes, maybe it's more intentional than that. I don't know where I'm going with this other than to say that I think it's to our advantage that we have situations like this where we can gain so many different perspectives and just learn new things. And that gives a much more clear picture of what justice would look like or should look like. And maybe sometimes give a clue about who would be affected by that and how to go about it. But thank you, Frank.
Yep, thank you.
Casket, you're up.
When I read the second tenet, the biggest thing that stands out to me is just the second part of it, which we should be prevailing over laws and institutions. That part is my favorite because I feel like I kind of think more inward on this one more than outward. And I'll just use, say the Black Lives Matter protests as an example. But, I did my fair share of protesting and things, but really it's kind of about looking inward and knowing that kind of as an individual, like the way I feel about it is that I am kind of above the law. Like I'm literally not going to let a police officer, a security guard, anybody in quote unquote power do anything to me that I wouldn't want to have happen to me naturally, I guess is the best way to put it. Yeah. I won't ever let anyone change anything about me, tell me how to live my life, how to, think that they're correcting me when I don't feel that should be happening, if that makes sense.
I suspect that you mean that you could attach the words, this is a different tenet, but you could attach the words within reason.
Yeah. Because you can definitely have that view and also be a murderer and think that, you should be able to walk the streets and rape and murder however much you want because you're above the law.
or just whatever it is, so I want this thing and, it's about $8 more than I think it's worth. So, whatever. There's a lot of that. But of course, we exist in a society. We've got to play nicely when possible.
Yeah.
But you get a sense, I'm sure, as an individual when something is over the line.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's a very tough one, but yeah, I feel like I don't think a lot of us really agree with a lot of the laws that are in place right now or how they're handled. And so it's kind of just trying to stay away from that as much as possible, if at all possible.
Yeah. There's so many instances of laws that I'm sure any of us could think of right now, like that's dumb. That's either just a dumb law, it doesn't make sense, or it's mean-spirited, or this wasn't thought through, you name it. There's a million of these laws. But those same organizations, the same system overall that provides us with those laws that are obviously fucked up and just ridiculous, they also provide us with all the other laws, the ones that we're like, yeah, that makes sense. The ones that are there to protect us, the ones that do protect us and that we rely on. And man, it's just layer after layer of complications and pain in the ass. Yeah. And those same fucking cops, right? These fucking cops, right? My stance on the police, I don't know if I should say this on a publicly viewable thing, but okay. My stance regarding the police generally has been fuck the police. That's just kind of where I sit in my life. But having said that, if some kind of shit's going down at my house, I guess I'm going to call the police. What the fuck else am I going to, you know what I mean? Like they're the police. So you're supposed to assume that the things are going to work the right way or the way they're designed to or whatever.
Yeah. Well, and it's all about, now this is kind of a tangent, but, calling the appropriate people for the appropriate situation. So, just now, especially in Portland, I feel like, it's definitely things have changed a lot since the protests. Mm-hmm. There's been a lot more violence and theft and things because the police are not responding because a lot of them have left the force.
Yeah.
So people are kind of, reeling from that and, getting confused. And it's like, well, this is kind of what we were protesting for, right? Was to not have as many of you that are being violent and, things like that. So, it is what it is. That's kind of the consequence of that nobody really thought through. But also calling, there's a lot of programs out there to do welfare checks on people and to respond to, mental health crises rather than just calling the police because there's, a transient person that is yelling on the street. Let's not call the cops for that. Let's actually call, people that are trained to respond to, houseless people and people with mental health issues and things like that.
Yeah.
So that plays a huge part too. And just, knowing that, or, I know of some states that don't have like animal control and stuff, and they just call police to deal with animals and they just like kill the animals, because the police aren't really for that. So there's like, areas of the US that do that, I guess too, which is,
I wonder if, and again, we could go down a rabbit hole in any direction here, but I wonder if maybe in some nearish future, the police, in part, in addition to what their duties ought to be, maybe there'll be some sort of middleman directing these calls or things to the appropriate places. By default, it's going to take a long time for mainstream society to adjust from the mindset of something's wrong, call the cops. Like that's kind of what it's been for a long time. Because who the fuck else are you going to call? We don't know the option. Where do you call the other people? I don't know what other people, who knows? By default, the cops are going to be the first option. And I think, the quickest way to improve that situation might be to just let them accept that call and then send it where it needs to go.
Yeah, have kind of everybody kind of all on standby and have the operators instead just kind of triage stuff, kind of to the right place. Yeah.
If I had a random animal situation going on in my neighborhood, I don't know. I don't have a number to call. I don't know who to call. I'm sure there is something, maybe, I guess, but off the top of my head, I know how to call 911. I don't know who else to call, but I'm sure we could figure it out, but it's going to take time.
Yeah.
And like you're probably, like you said, in Portland and the surrounding areas, people didn't want police and they weren't entirely, maybe it's a little bit of a knee-jerk reaction, but you can certainly relate to the sentiment of, well, fuck this, fuck these police. We don't even want these police.
Yeah.
And it's reasonable to have that emotion. But now, there's a police shortage. And it's like you just can't win,
Yeah. Well, and that's why I like, kind of thinking more of stuff like this more inward and not, the outward protesting. Like I'm all for it to a point, but I mean, looking at the aftermath now, I mean, we're almost a couple years past it. And I mean, half of downtown Portland is boarded up. And there's, a lot of stuff is just taken over with, tent cities and stuff like that, because there's more space for that now because there's no businesses anymore. Everything's shut down there, and it's kind of a ghost town down there, and it's really creepy.
Yeah, that's wild.
So people are moving here from California going, there's no fancy restaurants or, it's all weird down here.
Yeah. People are fleeing California for all kind of reasons. And some of them land in Portland and are in for a shock.
And making it more expensive for everybody to live here.
Right. So, yeah. All right. Thank you, Casket. Noelle, you're up.
So I usually look at the big picture, and I just have it written down here, so just bear with me. So just like each species changes and evolves along with the ever-changing environment, ideas of freedom and justice do as well. It is unavoidable that we must keep up with this changing atmosphere. Laws and institutions are byproducts of these ideas, and by the time they are solidified in function, they will begin to expire in relevance and must be revised again. Change is the only constant. There will never be a permanent answer for all times and all peoples. So, the struggle for justice is an ongoing and necessary pursuit that should prevail over laws and institutions. That's it.
Yes, well said, Noelle.
That's what I got.
Well said, Noelle. Thank you. Yeah. Bobby, what have you got?
I think our society in general is just complacent. They don't care. Nobody cares what's going on until something extreme happens. No one's paying attention. Nobody's reading these House bills, Senate bills, and they're difficult to read. I actually read them. The state ones are easier. They're pretty straightforward. The federal ones, they sneak a lot of shit in there.
Oh, yeah.
And these laws aren't objective. Most of them are largely based in religion. Like right now in Ohio, there are two different laws that are going to get voted on. There's a Senate bill and a House bill making it illegal for a doctor to perform surgery on a woman with an ectopic pregnancy without implanting it into the uterus. The physician would be charged with murder.
Yeah.
This is not a thing. This is science fiction.
Yeah.
This would kill women.
And they put that law in place so that it won't be done.
Yeah. Because it's the people who wrote the laws. One's a Catholic, one's a Christian. And, they wrote these bills and they're to be voted on. And they have no knowledge of anything medical. These people are so far removed from what they are writing laws about. It's ridiculous. Like if you don't know, an ectopic pregnancy is where it implants somewhere else inside your body. It could be anywhere. It's not in the uterus.
Right.
And they want doctors to take it and just put it in the uterus, which is just, it will kill people.
Yeah. I don't know the specifics of that, but it sounds troubling. The motivation there is to make it just not even be a thing, make it.
But we need to pay attention to what's going on, what they're trying to do.
And they do make every effort to make it really hard to do that.
They do, but it's all out there.
Yeah.
All proposed bills are on the government websites. You can read them.
Yeah, and I think you started maybe by just saying that we get, or people generally can get complacent about things, and I felt that for sure. I mean, I've been guilty of that. I'm not sure if guilty is the word, but maybe it is. I've definitely fallen into that. I've been frustrated and lost hope sometimes in the general political system and the way things work. I've felt that way. And I know it doesn't always lead to the most, it's not always the most helpful thing, but it happens. Thank you, Bobby. Who have we got up next? Kate.
So I was just going to touch on, Cora was talking about it a little bit earlier. When I think about the tenet, I think about like what the actual struggles we face as Satanists. And I think Christian nationalism is one of the biggest struggles that we face as Satanists. Mm. And I just think that like when they infuse their religion with these laws and institutions. And then when we think about when we're saying justice has priority over these laws and institutions, I think that we can actually infer from this tenet that as modern Satanists, separation of religion and these institutions is actually what's important here too. So I feel like getting out of this tenet is also important, that we're separating the two as well.
What is an example of what you mean more specifically?
So like when we're saying like prevailing over laws and institutions, mm-hmm. we're also making sure that our religion that our religion is separated from the two as well. So we're not infusing our religion with those institutions or laws.
Yeah, just a more of a general separation of church and state.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Because I feel like with the rise of Christian nationalism being so prominent in America now, it's becoming a big threat within our society. It's getting a little hectic out there.
So I always, by default, I believe that there should definitely be a pretty significant separation of church and state. I'm a big fan of that idea. I never think that in reality it exists enough. There isn't enough of a separation for me. However, what about and again, we might be out in the weeds a little bit here, guys, sorry. But what about, well, for example, the Satanic Temple is going to great lengths to use its status as a religious organization to create religious exemptions to laws, and specifically using that position as a church to have political power. That's specifically what it is, and I believe that's more or less the reason why the Satanic Temple wanted to be recognized as a religious organization by the government in the first place, which is counterintuitive. On paper, it makes no sense. We want separation of church and state, but if you want political power, you need to be a church. And so is involving a religious organization to create political change or gain political power a good move? I don't know. But it definitely muddies the waters a little bit, I think. But if that's the only way to get around it, even just using the isolated example of like abortions and the abortion ritual and abortion restrictions and all these things, if you want to get around some laws, start talking about your religion. I don't know. Is that a good thing? Is it a bad thing? I'm not sure. Thank you very much, Kate. Rob, you're up.
Given how our structure of our society is, using, like TST, using like religious exemptions, I think that's gaming the system. That's how we have to operate. There's so much little exemptions. There's always the religious exemptions of sort of all sorts of structures. Yeah. And it's, is it bullshit? Yeah. Do I think it's bullshit that you have to be in like a certain like Native American tribe to smoke peyote. Yeah, I do think that's bullshit. But somehow that's like the Supreme Court came up to that. Like, oh, well, someone said you can't make me criminalize my smoking peyote because that's my religious right to smoke peyote.
Oddly, the Satanic Temple is sort of an exception to this in a way, but so often, especially with religious exemptions, you're gaining an advantage or you're being given some special privilege in exchange for being superstitious and anti-scientific. Like, I believe in this God or this spirit or this whatever the fuck, and so therefore I want to do a thing that's illegal. Is that cool? Yes, we'll grant you that. What the fuck are we talking about? Like, that's not a real thing in a good system. That is a flaw, I find. But of course, it is the same flaw that you say. It's being exploited by the Satanic Temple. Just the fact that system exists for there to be such a thing as a religious exemption, which in and of itself is a wild fucking idea. Religious exemption. Like, laws are laws, but they're not because we have religious exemption.
Well, even Thomas Aquinas said that an unjust law is no law at all, and that guy's a Christian saint. So, I mean, maybe that's what it kind of draws from as far as a legal tradition of why even Christian nationalists are probably going for this type of stuff.
Yeah. And last thing, you mentioned some of those folks might not use the word justice, but if you boil it down, like they might use the word like right, like we want to do what is right. And, whether that feels just or even, like justice, we talked about the scales, that's sort of the symbol of justice, right? The balanced scales. And that's justice when everything is in balance and things are working and the crime fits the punishment and you name it.
What's right is me having more power than other people. That's that's what's right is.
Yeah. What feels right for one person may not feel so right for somebody else. Thanks, Rob. Tiffany, you're up.
So just like Kate mentioned, the one thing that struck me with this second tenet is really how specific it is to Satanists and like TST in particular, just because of like all the lobbying and the work that they do just to bring us a place at the table. Like you mentioned, a lot of the laws and, using it to our advantage to be, an actual quote unquote religion, right? Like that, whether or not that's like a valid point, we need that in order to actually like make things happen for us. Especially like look at Texas, but like, I was looking at some of the reading material that they have on the TST site, and I started reading one of the books there, talking about like the specific Christian America concept and the Christian nationalists. And, it's really interesting to me just to look at the history of it. And like, I think a couple people said too, educating yourself with any kind of topic as far as justice wise, and to see, where the roots kind of stem for, the mix of corporate and Christianity and the politics of it. And just looking at just for so long, how I think we touched on this in the very beginning, Christian white men have had a seat at the table and they were the ones to make the laws, and they're the ones then that have that bias, whether implicit or not. And, they get to have that say for the rest of us.
Let me just preface this by saying I'm playing devil's advocate a little bit here. If white men, people land on a patch of earth and they figure it out from there, right? They build what they build, they make systems and it goes the way it goes. If everyone is essentially equal and these Christian white men, through whatever means, got themselves into the position that they're in of dominance, is that fair? Did they earn it? And is it their duty to give it up? Or is it their very nature, by being an animal, to want to preserve it?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think some people have mentioned too about, justice evolving. And, I think when we look at, especially like taking your kind of example and making it specific to like America, I think some of the people would argue that at the time of us declaring our independence, like, okay, well, that was maybe the majority at the time, right? Yeah. But that is not the case anymore. When you look at our diverse landscape of people, white Christian man is maybe not the majority anymore. And so what does that look like, as far as laws and everything else? And especially when you talk about like religion, because I think, back then there was not as much sharing of ideas. There wasn't as much like education or communication to know how diverse we really were. And now we have all these tools, like you said, to connect us so that we can talk to people that aren't like us and know things. And so having that at our fingertips to have education and have better resources, I think, is another thing that you can't just say like, oh, I didn't know, as far as like oppressing something or not giving someone, a say at the table.
I guess it goes without saying, part of it is always going to be struggling to have a seat at the table. Whoever doesn't wants it. The people who have it don't want to give it up. And this is where we find ourselves. Is that it, Tiffany? Are you good?
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Casket, you're up.
Just building on everything that's been said in the last 10 or so minutes. The only small thing I would add is kind of more of a question, which is if justice is an ongoing pursuit and needs to prevail over laws and institutions, should we go outside of laws and institutions to change things? And who needs to do that? That's kind of the biggest thing, I think, too. And I tried to touch on that, I think, and I just got really awkward and didn't really say that last time.
Well, I mean, is that the very nature of protest sometimes?
Yeah.
You're certainly not allowed to be standing in the middle of the street, blocking traffic, hollering. You sure as shit can't throw anything. You can't do these things. Surely that's against some law that's on the books.
Vigilantism.
Yeah,
like
all
Dan
of
mentioned.
it. Yeah, all of it against the law. And I think early on, that's what brought my attention to the idea of, when you were mentioning, we want less cops. Well, now you got less cops. We don't want this system. Well, now you don't have it how you like it. It's a fine balance. It's a fine balance.
Yeah.
And
and I'm not even necessarily saying like, oh, we should all just raise hell and, just anarchy and, fires everywhere and, to burn everything down or whatever. But, even just breaking laws, like in really, like, I can't even think of an example, but just like doing very sly, kind of,
sure,
just kind of quiet things that are just sort of happening in the background.
But also, I think there's maybe a place for the other stuff.
Yeah.
Sure. I think there's a time and a place for it. When all right, I'll just get into it for a minute here. When all of that goes on, all of that stuff goes on, when George Floyd aftermath, is always the most recent sort of one that's in our memory. When that goes on, it starts from a place of just emotional response, right? It's like, what the fuck? Why would they do this? How could they do this? This is shitty. Fuck these guys. It's all emotion, right? And then people do what they do. There's going to be protests and the purpose of these protests ought to be to express that dissatisfaction with the way the system is playing out and to demand attention on the issue, on the example. And the reason for all of that is to hopefully provide change. Seeking justice is the way. And that's what it's for. But in reality, on the ground, when it's all going down, we've seen this story before, and we've seen the nuance of how it plays out. Like, you have protesters, right? And then what else do you have? It's looters. That's the word they always use on the news, right? Looters, rioters, looters, and you have protesters. And I guess on paper, the separation is supposed to be, if you're really protesting something, you're just peacefully protesting. You're Martin Luther King Jr., you know? You do what you're supposed to do, you give your message, and you will enact change. You don't need to throw a cinder block through the mom and pop store on the corner, because what the fuck? Why would you do that? Who is it helping? Has it ever helped? No, of course not. Anybody who is a little bit old like me and remembers when all of this shit already happened in Los Angeles in the 90s, we watched it. We watched Los Angeles burn. We watched people get killed for no reason. We watched everything get fucking destroyed because of police violence. So the thought is, if we do this, if we freak out, if we break up our whole city, then we won't have people killed by the cops anymore, obviously. Well, look at us. Here we are. How many years later? How many times has this happened since Rodney King till now? 4 million times, I'm guessing, approximately. And so when it happens the next time, they will do it again. Everyone will do the same things again. And it will happen again, unfortunately, and people will react in all the same ways, unfortunately. But we hope that over time, we're weathering away at it. I don't know. It's frustrating. When I was watching that shit go down, and like it was happening, near here in Philadelphia, our center city was getting all fucked up. And my thought was that all of those same actions, especially out in Minneapolis, all that same energy and actions and aggression and all of that stuff, we understand where it comes from. And if the goal of it is change, then I think it's so much more potent if you take it and aim it not at the Apple Store, but at the police station where all of that shit was the problem to begin with. It seemed like a wasted opportunity to me that hurt people that didn't need to be hurt and didn't deserve to be hurt. And it was just a missed opportunity, energy misspent on the wrong target, I feel like. And it's just an unfortunate part of it all.
It sure is. Yeah. Well, and then the other thing too, is that, there are people that do try to make changes in different ways, especially regarding police, by becoming police officers themselves and coming from, different backgrounds and stuff. And they go, okay, well, I'm going to be part of this and I'm going to change everything from the inside. And I'm going to, be watchful of my colleagues and know when somebody is doing shady shit, and I'm going to, report them or, do everything I can to get them out of the force and just kind of work from the inside. And so I do have some appreciation for people like that.
Of course.
They're definitely very, far and few between, but I do understand that mindset too. And I do like that.
If we had a whole lot of those people, that might be really legitimately helpful.
I love, some fire and some violence and things like that directed in the right way, but I do like that sneaky shit too.
Absolutely.
Very intelligent, quiet, sneaky, stuff. Yeah.
There's one mindset is basically what you're describing, the idea of infiltrating the system, or that even has a negative connotation, but it's really improving the system from the inside, get in there and overcome the bullshit and hope for change. And there's another mindset. I won't dare try to find like the real quote, but the notion is that you can't change or fix a system by playing by that system's rules, essentially. It's impossible, or so it goes. And I don't know, they both feel kind of valid. Both of those viewpoints seem valid. I don't know what the right answer is, but they both feel true,
and maybe both need to happen at the same time.
Cool. Well, thank you, Casket. And with that, we will conclude this episode. Now, this was just an edited down section of what was a very lively 2.5 hour discussion. So if that type of thing interests you, consider joining up with the gang in Satanic Delco and participate with us. We'd love to have you. Until next time, you can visit the website at hailsatanpodcast.com. Stay safe out there, and hail Satan.
Gunnar Schmidt and the Eagle Free Service.